Time to elevate. You're running on empty with Matt and Tony.
Hey, everybody, welcome to Running on Empty. I am Matt.
And I'm Tony.
And we're running on empty. And Tony, we got a really good one this time.
Yes, we are joined by one of my heroes, actually. He's a democracy champion in the state of Wisconsin, and his name is Jay Heck. And let's welcome in Jay. And let me say a little bit about him. For more than 20 years, Jay Heck has been the executive director of Common Cause in Wisconsin. He's a nationally recognized expert on all matters related to election law, including things like campaign finance, ethics, redistricting, and many other issues. Prior to joining Common Cause Wisconsin in 1996, he spent 8 years as a top advisor and legislative strategist for the Wisconsin State Senate Majority Leader, and 8 years as the legislative director and campaign director and chief fundraiser for a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. He also served as a state director and staff member for a presidential candidate. He's got a Bachelor of Arts with honors degree in political science and history. And today, Jay is going to tell Matt and I, this should be a regular feature, Matt, what the heck is going on from Jay Heck. Jay, thank you so much for being here.
Tony, it's great to be with you. And just so your listeners know this, I have known you for well over 20 years. In fact, I still have a picture when I had a beard of me sitting up in a television studio in Oshkosh with you and the former mayor of Oshkosh, Jim Mather, doing your cable television program.
Yes.
And ironically, we were talking about the very same issues that we'll be talking about today. So
yeah, we were. And back then we had all kinds of scandals going on in Wisconsin government. And you were, of course, were on top of that, educating the public as to what was going on, and also educating people as to how they could go about becoming reformers in all of this. And we're going to get to that later. But let's start off, Jay, with since the presidential election, the Republican Party has gone into overdrive trying to pass what can only be called voter suppression efforts across the country. They've tried to deny that, correct? They've tried to say, oh, no, this is just about making sure voting is fair. But can you explain to us, for example, what happened in Georgia? Why are the law that was passed in Georgia, why, in your judgment, is that an especially bad example?
Well, to begin with, it's important to note that the Republican Party has not always been this way.
Right.
I grew up in a Republican household in upstate New York. We were what you call Rockefeller Republicans. There was a strain of Republicanism that emanated from Abraham Lincoln, which was that more people should vote. The party of Lincoln actually won the Civil War and passed voting rights measures for people of color and opened up the voting system. So, it wasn't really until the 1980s that you saw the Republican Party begin to turn in a different direction. And really beginning under Reagan, there were a number of Republicans who decided that more voting is not good for us. If we can restrict the number of people that vote in certain states and around the country, then that will actually be better for Republicans, because we know that some of the people that would have difficulty voting, particularly people of color, for instance, or younger people, college students, they often don't vote Republican. And so if we can restrict them and make it more difficult for them to vote, then that's something that would be beneficial to us. And that took hold around the country and certainly in Wisconsin, beginning in the 2000s, but really accelerated across the country beginning in 2010, when Republicans all over the country, in something of a landslide election, captured the legislatures in all of the big upper Midwestern states, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, a number of others. And they decided the thing to do would be to impose very strict voter ID laws, what we call a voter photo ID. And it was all premised in the idea that there is fraud, that people commit fraud by voting. Now, there's never any evidence of fraud. There's never any cases that are brought to court. There's never anybody arrested. But the Republicans kept saying that we have to prevent fraud, and that the way that we can do that is to make sure that everybody has a photo ID. You need a photo ID to rent a video, although of course nobody rents videos anymore. But they made this ridiculous argument that, you need a photo ID to do so many things. You need to have one to vote because there's so much fraud, even though there wasn't any fraud.
Right. You've been studying this for many years. So actual voter fraud is how rare is it?
You standing in the middle of Lake Superior on a 2x4 in the middle of winter and being struck by lightning is more likely than the incidences of voter fraud. It just doesn't occur. And the reason it doesn't occur is because it's a felony. You cannot impersonate somebody else and get away with it because it's easy to check on voter rolls whether you have voted or not. And in the very few cases where they do find somebody, it's because they're able to. I mean, there just isn't voter fraud. It doesn't happen. But nevertheless, this has become the mantra that has caught on with so many people, particularly in the Republican Party, because when they lose elections, they need to blame it on something, and rather than blame it on the lack of ideas or good candidates.
Right. So Donald Trump lost Georgia fair and square. Yeah, even the Republican Secretary of State, what's his name? Raffensperger.
Brad Raffensperger.
Yeah. Right. Even he was getting bullied by Trump, but he stood his ground. Even he said it was a clean, fair election. But I think even he now has supported these so-called reforms in Georgia. So what have they done in Georgia, Jay, that is, in your judgment, a voter suppression?
Well, what they've done in Georgia, and it's again a template for what they're doing all over the country. Same types of things are being introduced in legislators all over the country, including Wisconsin, where I work. But basically, what they're trying to do is make it's sort of death by 1,000 knife cuts. And the way they do this is they try to take the absentee voting that occurred all over the country, unprecedented because of the greatest pandemic, the greatest public health crisis that we've had in this country since the 1919 influenza that struck across the country. And so as a result of many more people voting by absentee, in Georgia, what they decided to do was really make it much more difficult for people to vote by absentee ballot. Same thing that they're doing in Wisconsin. And so what they've done is made it more difficult to apply to vote by absentee. They've restricted the excuses or what the reasons that people would apply to vote by absentee ballot. We have something in Wisconsin and elsewhere called you can declare yourself indefinitely confined, which means that you decide for yourself whether you want to go out and go to a polling place, or rather you would you prefer to vote by absentee ballot, or as in some states like Colorado, Oregon, vote completely by mail. I mean, that is what some states do. But in Georgia, Wisconsin, and others, what Republicans have decided to do is to say, no, we'll decide for you whether or not you can apply and become indefinitely confined. We'll decide whether you're sick or not. We'll decide whether you need to go show up at a polling place even though you don't want to, and even though it's inconvenient for you to do it. And then lastly, we will also make it more difficult for you to get any absentee ballot counted. And we'll do that by doing things like having only one place in the county. in Georgia, Fulton County, which is Metro Atlanta, 4 million people. Only one place now where you will be able to drop off your absentee ballot. Now, and the reason that's important is because the mail is not as dependable as it used to be,
Right.
because of what the Trump administration did to the U.S. Postal Service. A guy by the name of Louis DeJoy, a very wealthy donor, became the Postmaster General.
Is he
of
still
the
in there?
United States, and took out counting machines and sorting machines in the Milwaukee post office and all over the country. And mail is decidedly slower now. So you cannot count on your absentee ballot getting to the clerk in time for it to be counted. But you can't return it to a library or to a drop box or to a park like we could here in Madison anymore, because we're only going to have one place where you can return it. So it's all of these items. It's the accumulation of so many smaller things. When you put them all together, they will make it more difficult for people to vote in general, to vote by absentee ballot, to vote if you don't have a driver's license and you have to depend on public transportation. Or in Wisconsin, it is more difficult for a college student to vote if they do not have a Wisconsin driver's license than it is in any other state in the country. Because the photo ID that they issue in Wisconsin at public colleges and universities, including the University of Wisconsin-Madison, University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh, you cannot use that photo ID. You have to get a different photo ID if you're a college student. So again, these are all things that are designed to make it more difficult for people to vote. Fewer voters in the eyes of Donald Trump and his supporters means that Republicans will win more elections.
Wow. Go ahead, Matt.
That's the theory. I mean, I think, that it is going to bite them in the ass in the long run. I mean, we've been in Colorado 6 years. We've been doing mail-in voting, never had a problem, can drop it off right here in our town. There's one spot to drop it off. That's fine. But it's not like there's a huge line to do it. And I like the mail-in voting, first of all, because there's 50 things on there we have to look at, especially all the judges and whatnot. And so we sit down, they send actually a little book out with it to explain if there's any referendums or things like if you vote yes on this, if you vote no on this. And we sit down as a family and discuss these things. I mean, sometimes we vote differently, sometimes we vote the same, whatever, but we've got an opportunity to do it, then mail it in. When, prior to COVID and everything, my wife and I vacationed in Grand Cayman, and Election Day is a holiday, meaning that the stores are closed, everything's closed. You will vote today. That's all there really is to do. You can't have an excuse, go vote. And I'm thinking, couldn't the United States do something like that where they make Election Day a national holiday? And this is just what we do. I don't know if that's even possible, but that just would make sense to me. And from my perspective, it just seems that, boy, the Republicans aren't winning, so we have to do whatever it takes to cheat so we can win. But I'm telling you, I think it's going to bite them in the ass in the long run. That's my thought anyway.
Well, you could be right. On the other hand, if they continue to be successful in making it more difficult for people to vote, then they're able to, that's why they're able to hold on to power in places like Texas.
Yeah.
Some of these other places where the demographics are changing, where certainly old conservative gun-toting white men are no longer the majority in some of these states, and yet they continue to hold on power because of their ability to be able to restrict voting. And just let me give you an example of one of the things that was tried or has been tried in Georgia and is being tried here in Wisconsin. It just shows you how petty it is. And that is for an absentee ballot that we're talking about, a ballot that you mail in. In Wisconsin, you are required to sign the outside of the envelope. And then a witness is required to sign the outside of the envelope in which you mail it in. And the witness is also supposed to write down their address. Now, under current law in Wisconsin, there were many people that had a witness signature, which they have to have, but the address wasn't filled in. And so under current Wisconsin law, it was perfectly okay for an election clerk to be able to say, oh yeah, well, I know that person lives at so-and-so, and the election clerk at City Hall could fill in what the address was.
Sure.
And so in that way, they were able to count thousands of absentee ballots which were done wrongly, because for the first time, it was the first time for many people to ever vote by absentee ballot. So people didn't know how to do it. But under what happened in Georgia and what they're trying to do in Wisconsin, if the address is not, so the witness signs it, but if they don't fill in the address, the clerk cannot fill in the address. And the absentee ballot has to be mailed back to the person who sent the absentee ballot, even if it's just right before the election. And of course, it's not counted. It would effectively disenfranchise tens of thousands of people.
Wow.
And it seems like a minor thing. But what happens is, if you combine that with having only one drop-off box per county, by the slower mail system, by making it harder for people to declare indefinitely confined, by having to reapply every time for an absentee ballot. Now in Wisconsin, you can say, I want all of my voting to be done by absentee ballot. They're trying to change the law that says you have to reapply after every election to vote by absentee, and you have to show your photo ID in order to do that. A lot of people. So
basically, the Republicans are saying to certain constituencies, especially in Wisconsin, if you are not already in our corner, we are going to make you work as hard as possible to get your vote in.
Yep.
That's just so unconscionable.
It's even more cynical than that, because what they're doing is they're effectively disenfranchising many of their own voters, older voters that live in rural Wisconsin who vote Republican, but who understandably, if they at least were, if they believed that COVID was serious, were fearful of going to polling places to vote. Mm-hmm. And so those people are going to suffer. But the calculation, it's so cynical. The calculation is that more people who vote by absentee are Democrats. So even if we have to disenfranchise 10,000 of our voters, we'll be able to disenfranchise 20,000 of the other party. And so we'll be net winners. That's how cynical it is.
In Wisconsin, we have a Republican majority in the legislature, both the Assembly and the Senate. We've got a Democratic governor. Can the governor veto these changes?
He can, and that's what's different about Wisconsin from, say, Georgia or Arizona, where you have the Republican trifecta, the Republican governor and the Republican-controlled legislature. In Wisconsin, there is a Democratic governor, and the governor can veto these measures, and the Republicans do not have a veto-proof majority. They don't have 3/5 in either house of the Wisconsin legislature to be able to override the veto of the governor. But one would think that that's fine, and we should be okay with that. But here's the cynical calculation. The Republicans aren't doing this just for 2021, 2022. They know they're not likely to get it put into law in 2021 for the 2022 elections. But they are calculating that the 2022 midterm election in Wisconsin and around the country will do what usually happens when you have a president of one political party, and that is that the other political party will gain seats in governorships. And the Republicans in Wisconsin are calculating they will gain the governorship. I'm not even going to tell you some of the names of the people who are being floated, although you would know them all, Tony. Yeah, but they're calculating that they will get the governorship and maintain their majorities in the legislature. And then in early 2023, 2 years from now, they will ram through all this stuff that's all had a trial run in 2021. So it's the long term, and it's what conservatives and anti-progressives do very well, much better, I would argue, than progressives. And that is think strategically and think for the long term about how they're going to not only gain power, but keep power for decades.
Well, one thing that they're also doing, probably as we speak, is plotting how to gerrymander the congressional districts based on the census results. Now, Jay, can you explain to our audience what is gerrymandering and why is it so destructive of representative democracy?
Sure. Well, briefly, every 10 years, and this has happened since the United States was formed in 1789. it's in the Constitution that every 10 years, all of the people in the nation need to be counted for the purposes of population and then distributing federal money. And of course, in 1790, white males were counted. People of color were counted as 3/5 of a person because they were slaves. But nevertheless, it has been a constitutional requirement that we count everybody. And then based on that count, they then redistribute the legislative and congressional seats. Really, since the 1960s, it's been required that every state legislative and congressional seat have the same number of voters. That's what's called one person, one vote. And so that means that any population shift that occurred during the previous 10 years, the legislative districts have to be redrawn and the congressional districts to reflect the shifts in population so that you have an equal number of people in each of the districts. So that's sort of the long thing. Now, what happens is that legislatures, if they want to do it, and they did in Wisconsin for the first time in 2010, if they want to, they can be very partisan about this. And so gerrymandering is what's called, it's unfair distribution of the voters to create a partisan advantage for one political party. Sure. And so in Wisconsin, what the Republicans did, because they had control of both houses of the legislature and the governorship, is they packed Democrats into fewer state legislative and congressional districts.
Of course they did.
They spread Republicans out over more of them. And then they used the advantages that they had gained through voter suppression and through campaign finance laws by eliminating limits on corporate money. By combining all of those things, they guaranteed that they would have control of both houses of the legislature for 10 years because of the way they drew the districts. They did the same thing in Ohio. They did the same thing in Michigan, Pennsylvania. Now, just so Democrats are not, patted on the back and counted as the good people, the Democrats did the same darn thing in Illinois. They did the same thing in Maryland and Rhode Island. In Illinois, there was one guy who was just ousted last year, a guy by the name of Michael Madigan, who'd been the Speaker of the Illinois General Assembly for 42 straight years. I mean, that's how much power he had. It's all due to gerrymandering.
Right.
So, but it's been a Republican phenomenon in more states. And the Republicans in 2021 want to do the same thing that they did in 2011 in Wisconsin.
Yes, they do.
So they have already authorized $1 million of taxpayer money to be used to hire lawyers to draw maps in secret. And they will do the same thing they did in 2011. They will put their maps out, but it is different than 2011 in that we do have a Democratic governor. We don't have Scott Walker, a Republican governor in Wisconsin. So theoretically, the governor would be able to veto whatever gerrymandered maps are put forward by the Republicans this time, unless the Republicans try to do what they did 50 years ago in Wisconsin, and that is bypass the governor and pass their maps through what's called a joint resolution, which doesn't require the approval of the governor. The Wisconsin Supreme Court 50 years ago said that's unconstitutional. You can't do that. But Tony, as you well know, we have a radically conservative Wisconsin Supreme Court this time, a majority who doesn't pay any attention to what is known as stare decisis or precedent. They're more than happy to change the rules that they made 50 years ago in order to get the political result that they want. So we have to be concerned about that. Nevertheless, I think it's likely that we'll have a better result in Wisconsin because I don't think at the end of the day that the governor will be put out of the process. He'll be able to veto the partisan maps, and the governor's putting forward through something called the People's Maps Commission alternative maps that a judge would be able to look at, and then look at the Republican maps, the nonpartisan maps from the People's Maps Commission, and then do something of a compromise. That's usually how redistricting works out when you have divided government.
It sounds like
I
that.
know some states like, oh, go ahead, Matt. Go ahead, Matt.
What, like when you do like votes on things for schools, like we're going to raise property taxes, you have to have a referendum. Wouldn't this be something that you would think that should go out to the people saying, okay, here's the plan we've got. Let's everybody vote on it. That's never going to happen.
Oh, Matt, you're so spoiled. You live in one of those states where actually people actually have a say in being able to do something like that. You're in what's known as a direct democracy state. Half the states of the country have what's called initiative and referendum, where you can put an issue on the ballot, the voters vote for it, and it can bypass the legislature of your state to make law. Half the states in the country, including Wisconsin, do not have that. We have only the legislature. And so anything that becomes law has to go through the legislature, or it has to be undone by the legislature. We have advisory referendums in Wisconsin.
Sure.
Ironically, and I think Tony will appreciate this, it was the progressives about 100 years ago who sort of made the determination that they didn't want direct democracy in Wisconsin, because the progressives always thought that they would always be in power in Wisconsin. And so they didn't want any of their decisions bypassed by the people. They thought maybe they knew better. And of course that turned around and bit them in the behind. But no, you're right. I mean, it would, because overwhelming majorities of citizens, not only in Wisconsin, but in every state in the country, do not want gerrymandering. They want to have a nonpartisan system, and that's what they would be supportive of. So that's why in Wisconsin, the alternative to what we have would be to put into place what the state of Iowa has, where the legislature still votes on the maps,
Sure.
but they do not draw the maps. They're drawn by a nonpartisan state entity that uses nonpartisan criteria, and the legislature can only vote up or down on the maps. They can't amend them. They can't change them. They can only say, yes, those maps are fair, or no, we're not going to allow them to happen. And in Iowa, in 40 years, they've always voted for them, because in Iowa, they fear the wrath of the voters.
So in Iowa, Jay, what percentage of the legislative districts are competitive compared to Wisconsin, would you say?
Well, here's what's interesting about Iowa. They do not mandate competitiveness.
All right.
And if you think about it, you shouldn't mandate competitiveness, because in order to do that, you would have to use election results to get a desired result. So if you wanted to have more competitive elections in Wisconsin, you would have to specifically design each district to be competitive. In Iowa, the way they do it is they say, no, we're not going to mandate it. Instead, what we're going to do is have nonpartisan criteria in drawing the maps. For instance, squares are good, rectangles are good, keeping cities and counties together are good, and communities of interest.
Yeah.
Those things then make sense to voters, and people have confidence in those. Election results are never used to draw the lines in Iowa. They don't even take into consideration where legislators and congressmen live when they redraw the maps in Iowa every 10 years. So as a result of doing it that way, there are more competitive elections.
Yeah. So in Wisconsin, Jay, we have 99 assembly districts. How many let's take 2020. How many of those 99 assembly districts were actually competitive in 2020?
Well, competitive, if you define competitive, and I do it very liberally, any election that is within 10 points, 55 to 45% or less, for the purposes of this discussion, we could define as competitive. Although
I would agree with that.
A 55 to 45 is a blowout, actually, in reality. But in Wisconsin, there were only 10 of 99 assembly districts where the margin fell between 55 and 45.
So what that means is, if you're a Republican assembly person, you are probably more afraid of being primaried by another Republican than you are of the other party. Same thing with a Democrat who's in a district that is not competitive. Is that a fair statement?
That's exactly what happened in Wisconsin and has happened over the last 15 years. And a classic example, there's two classic examples, Tony, that you would know very well, be familiar with. There was a Republican state senator, powerful majority leader, a guy by the name of Michael Ellis, who represented Nina Menashe for many years. He was our champion with regard to campaign finance laws for many years, a conservative to be sure, but very independent in terms of not wanting special interest groups to tell him what to do, and somebody who totally depended on ideas as the way to win elections, not money or cheating or voter suppression. And Ellis was essentially threatened with a primary in 2014. He ran into some other trouble with Project Veritas, a right-wing group that ambushed him in a bar in Madison.
Right.
Took some uncompromising the video of him, but nevertheless, guys like him, guys like Senator Dale Schultz, another moderate Republican, all of those people were ousted, so that you have a much more conservative Republican caucus. By the way, same thing happened to the Democrats. Milwaukee used to be a place where you found a lot of pro-life Catholic Democrats, working class, union guys, but a lot of them pro-life, Catholic, Polish, ethnic, all through Manitowoc, the eastern Wisconsin, you'd find a lot of Democrats like that. They weren't sufficiently progressive for some Democrats. And so a lot of those folks were ousted in Democratic primaries. As you mentioned, that's where the elections are decided. And so as a result of that, we have much more lefty Democrats, much more far righty Republicans than we used to have. No consensus, no bipartisan cooperation, tremendous polarization.
So a couple of years ago, Jay, the Supreme Court had an opportunity to essentially outlaw this kind of abusive gerrymandering we're talking about, but the Supreme Court disappointed us in that, right? What happened there?
Well, the United States Supreme Court for years had said that we would take a look at partisan gerrymandering if the right case came to us.
Right.
And this was Justice Anthony Kennedy, who was a moderate conservative in the U.S. Supreme Court, who always was open to this possibility. And so finally, it was a Wisconsin case that was actually brought to him. And what they decided ultimately, and this was 2 years ago, and this was Justice Roberts, and I think one of the great punts of all time. He said that really federal courts are not equipped to be able to decide partisan gerrymandering. The courts can decide if gerrymandering is a result of racial composition or if there is some other issue like that. But if it's partisan politics, that's better left to the states to decide. And so it was a classic conservative punt. Of course, the U.S. Supreme Court has every right and the ability to ascertain whether a redistricting process was unfair because of partisanship. But what they said is we're going to leave it to legislatures and we're going to leave it to state courts to do it. And of course, in a state like Wisconsin, but also other states, the legislature is overwhelmingly conservative Republican, and even the court has become radically conservative. So it was an invitation to have the status quo continue in the states. And in Wisconsin, a conservative law firm and conservative activists have actually petitioned the Wisconsin Supreme Court to be the only court of jurisdiction when it comes to the redistricting process. They want to avoid circuit courts. They want to avoid any federal court involvement. They want the 4-3 conservative majority on the Wisconsin Supreme Court to rubber stamp the partisan maps that they're hoping that they'll be able to ram through the legislature, in the next month or two ahead. So again, strategic. They look at the courts, they look at the legislatures, they plan ahead, and they spend the money and they do all the things that they think they need to do in order to keep control. Because for the Republicans, it's all about control. And they'll do anything and everything that they feel they have to in order to maintain that iron grip on power.
Well, it's obviously lying and cheating is not like beneath them. So
if that's what it takes is sort of where they are. And when you have a guy like Donald Trump as president, and then you have all of these individuals now in the legislature who parrot him and are more than willing to repeat the lies and more than willing to repeat all the falsehoods and all the false premises on which they try to build this this agenda, they figure, well, as long as we control the legislature and we can gerrymander, it doesn't really matter whether what we say is true or not. And in fact, Tony, you would recall this. In 2018 in Wisconsin, there was a candidate who ran for the United States Senate against Tammy Baldwin, who was the incumbent Democratic U.S. Senator. Her name was Leah Vukmir, and she was a state senator from the Milwaukee area. She said quite openly, I don't have to listen to people that don't agree with me.
Right.
I can do whatever I want because I have a safe seat in the Wisconsin legislature. And if I don't agree with people, then I'm just not going to listen to them. I'll do whatever I damn well please. And that is the attitude that a lot of people have adopted.
Jay, all of this can sound really disempowering and kind of demoralizing. So what do you tell average everyday people when they hear these facts that you are saying and they say, wow, this almost seems like too big? What do we do?
Well, and of course, I'm glad you asked that question because I didn't mean to.
No, it's not. No, it's not.
Drag everyone down into the.
No, you're not. It's not you dragging everyone down. It's the facts of the situation that drag people down.
Yeah.
Well, the fact of the matter is that I think that the situation today is actually better than it was 10 years ago.
Oh,
because there are so many more people that get it now. When I would talk about redistricting reform and gerrymandering 10 years ago, maybe you and 4 other people in Wisconsin would be able to stay awake through the first 5 minutes of my presentation. Now everybody gets it. I mean, everybody understands that the gerrymandered seats have resulted in dysfunction and the lack of progress on so many other issues that people care about. People have made the connection. And by doing things like direct democracy, but in Wisconsin, we have advisory referendums where people all over the state have become involved in passing at the county level, overwhelmingly in every county, including red counties, advisory referendums saying, yes, we don't want to have partisan gerrymandering. We want the Iowa system here. So you have many poor people involved in that regard. You have many, many more people coming up through the ranks, younger people that are beginning to become politically involved in 2020, 2021 than we saw 10 years ago. On college campuses, despite how difficult it is to vote, in 2020, they were more active than they probably have been in Wisconsin, at least in my 25 years at Common Cause on campus, because people really understood the importance of getting people the ability to be able to vote. So I think all of that points to reform. We're going to have it not in 2022 in Wisconsin and in some states, but we'll have it before 2030. And, you could laugh and say, well, that's a little disheartening, but you shouldn't, because this is a long game. Democracy is something that has to be fought year in, year out, but also decade in, decade out.
Sure.
And I think we're on an upward trajectory, to tell you the truth. I think it's going to get better. The demographics of the country suggest that's the case. But I also think the people's connectivity to politics is greater now than it's ever
I agree with you, Jay. I see it among, I'm a college professor, as you know, and I work with a lot of people in the 18 to 22-year-old age group. And, there are some that bought into Trumpism. And I think many of them got it from their parents, other relatives, the community they were raised in. But really, the overwhelming majority that I see in this day and age, they're not really partisan as much as I'll call it action oriented. They realize that the global climate issue is an existential threat. And they seem to understand that we don't have time to play these stupid, petty games that you've been describing. So I'm just hoping that they choose to get active to make things happen rather than hoping that politicians in the baby boom generation are going to do it. Because, Jay, we baby boomers, I don't know what happened to our generation, right? Because we were like civil rights, women's rights, environment, and what happened?
I like to blame it on the internet. No, I don't know.
Yeah, well, maybe.
I don't know. We've been dumbed down. And look, to be honest, I mean, here's the difference too. In our generation as baby boomers, I mean, I never for a moment ever doubted that I would have a great future and that I would be able to do so many things, pretty much anything I wanted, in large part because I'm white and male, so I have that privilege, but also because the opportunities seem to be so, so limitless.
Yes.
Younger people don't have that. I mean, they understand. I mean, there's a finite end to the amount of oxygen left, and the ice caps, and all of those things. They have the world is becoming a tougher place to live, and so I think they are more serious about their future, and they have to be, and thank goodness they are. So I am very optimistic that the next generation is going to do a better job than we have, in large part because that's what they have to do in order to survive, in order for democracy to survive. I mean, we're no longer under any illusion that, we're always going to have a free and open democratic system in the United States. This last president showed us how uncomfortably close we came. Seeing that all come crumbling down. So I think people get that, and I think people are going to be willing to fight harder. And even if they don't join organizations like they used to, Common Cause, League of Women Voters, the Democratic Party, people, as you mentioned, they're cause oriented, and they can be really excited about certain issues, and they can use social media and all those things to take action and do it quickly. So I'm optimistic about it.
Jay, we're just about out of time. Thank you so much for being here. I think we should do a regular feature with you, and I think we should call it "What the Heck is Going On?"
Yeah, I agree 100% on that.
What the heck is going on? ... with Jay Heck, as opposed to what the heck is going on with Jay Heck. We don't really care what the heck is going on with you, but what is going on with these issues.
Let me tell you about the molding problem I have in my basement. No,
I was going to say.
That would be fun. I'd love to do that, but it's there's so many things to talk about, and there's so many people to do it. And thank you for doing this. This is why I have hope, because programs like this get out, and people listen to them, and they get ideas, and they get involved, and that's what it takes. It takes one individual getting out of getting away from their computer and going outside and taking action.
I agree.
Thank you so much for the insight and the information, and ending on an optimistic note. I mean, a lot of this is very doom and gloomish. But the younger generation really now is the time for them to make a really big statement and step up. And so that's where I'm optimistic, same as you guys. So thank you so much, man. This is awesome.
Thank you, man. Appreciate it. Thank you. Tony, good to talk to you. Good to see you again. Take care.
Yeah, good to see you too.
Tony, I got to say, I think this has got to be one of my favorite interviews ever, because every time we do this, I mean, I'm always learning something, but this really was an eye opener.
Yeah, Jay has got an encyclopedic knowledge of anything election related. He's really amazing. And
seriously.
Yeah, and just what I find so depressing is that the state legislature in Wisconsin that could really benefit from the expertise he brings to the table, the Republican majority has no interest anymore. And until that changes, we're going to be stuck with this kind of mediocrity and all the kinds of frustrations we discussed during the show. So, but Jay's been doing this for a long time, and we closed on an optimistic note. What I love about the man is he never gives up.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And neither can we, right? I mean, if you really want to see reform in this country, you just can't give up. You got to be in it for the long game.
Yeah. And that's what I think this show is doing too, is it's talking about some things. And again, we don't have too many, listeners or viewers right now, but it's growing a little bit every single episode. I see, a little bit more, a little subscriber here and there. So I think that our message is getting out there. I don't think we're saying anything too crazy radical. And if anybody disagrees with us, we welcome to have that conversation. If you agree with us, that's even better. But I think that, by talking about stuff like this, getting it out there, even if that's why I became a teacher a long time ago. It's that starfish story analogy about the kid throwing starfish back And this couple says, wow, there's so many of them, you can't make a difference. And he throws them back and says, I made a difference to that one. If we
yeah.
get even one person that sparks an interest or sparks a movement or something, we're doing the right thing. So, I'm glad we're doing this. I'm glad for interviews like Jay, and I can't wait to have him back on the show.
Yeah. And so looking forward to our next show, Matt. And
Absolutely.
so I guess until that next one, I guess we should all stay elevated.
You're running on empty with Matt and Tony.
After listening to Jay Heck's presentation, I now understand why things are so messed up.